Yeah, who are we marrying to? Who are you marrying? And hmm, it's a very good question. Who are you marrying? Have you ever realized like you just laying in bed with somebody and you're realizing that who is this person? This is not the person that I thought I knew. And I think modern dating apps, as well as AI curated personas, have created this illusion and tendency to fall in love with a profile person instead of the actual person. And so when you're sitting in bed with them, in the evening or random Tuesday, and you like realizing who is this person, you know, and it's really important that we ask these questions within our society, when we are talking about marriage and relationships, you know, who are you marrying to? And what is the dangers of idealizing a person in the relationship? For those who are new here, my name is Bianca. I speak a lot about many topics. I'm a lover of fashion sustainability. I'm a lover of life experiences. I have gone through a lot in my life. I'm also a lover of psychological insight and deconstructing the identities. I've had to do a lot of inner work within myself, a lot of healing because of the projections and the narratives that family friends have tried to place over me. And I think this is something, in terms of marriage and relationships, with the opposite sex or the people that we, mingle with. It's really important to realize that we kind of idolize each other in every relationship. We idolize each other falsely, or we over idolize, each other through friendship, through friends. And this particular video is about idolizing, the person we are in love with and the person that we want to fall in love with, right? Um, I've noticed that we basically create a psychological or an architecture of wanting to we create an internal void, but we also looking for a missing piece, of identity within the person, and we often kind of like create a role for them to play, especially if we have not healed our childhood wounds, our childhood traumas, And I also noticed that when we marry people, or when you see somebody married, you realize that they're not just married to that individual, they're also married to the society. They're married to the society of that person's lifestyle. They are married to their family. They are married to the traumas that that family carried. It gets really deep, guys. And I realize that, it's very important to be careful and to be wise, first of all, who we dating, but also realizing who are we married to, because a lot of people are very good at hiding their traumas, or there are a lot of people are really good at creating a facade, in the relationships, the first years, the honeymoon phases. But the moment you really get into marriage with somebody, you realize that, oh my gosh, this person is a monster. Or you realize that you've married into a cult, or you've married into listen, you've married a beast, right? So when we talk about who you married to, it's let's talk about what are we looking at within ourselves? What missing piece are we looking at within the individual we married to, I've seen this with women, and I've seen this with men, where if they have not healed their mother wounds or their father wounds, especially for men, they tend to idolize the female. They love women who are strong, independent, who can have it down, who can take care of themselves, and it's something that they admire and inspire. But truly, what they're saying is they're looking for somebody in the relationship to take care of them, like their strong mother did for them. And when you are not healed, and when you hear all these inspirational idealizations as a woman, you kind of feel like, wow, he loves me for me. But truly speaking, he's also, as a man, an unhealed man, looking for an identity piece to fill a void that he once had with his mother. And society kind of accepts that kind of role, and you can see that there's an imbalance, of who holds this power, within the relationship, this idealization, where we not just men, by the way, also with females. And I think it's really big this time around, where most females, most people, actually, most females and men, we haven't really had a father figure that provided stability and a provision, and a sense of growth, within families. A lot of families have had very shaky fathers, and most of the mothers became the fathers, and we really are in a society right now where the dynamic of provision and protection is carried by the woman, whether we like it or not. She becomes the single mother raising three kids. She becomes the single mother providing school, food for the household, and we see this. And so our narrative and our identity of who's the provider is very, it's distorted, and so this shows also within a female, where we idolize a man on how we want him to take care of us. We want him to provide. We want him to, show that he's a man. And yet, we haven't really healed the manly wounds of our own fathers. And it becomes a role that people are carrying, a role that people did not audition for in marriage and in relationships. Um, and it's very interesting how this sometimes can create resentment, because on the one side, we are outsourcing our self-worth to a romantic interest, but we stop seeing the actual individual, and we stop loving the actual individual. We only start seeing them as a utility for fulfilling our needs and to fulfill this missing piece of our identity we didn't have within our childhood wounds. It's very deep. And so, what happens now when you are in the burden of being an icon in the relationship, the burden of being the strong, independent woman in the relationship? What happens when you are not able to fulfill this role, or to fulfill this provider role in the relationship, the strong role in the relationship that helps heal the other person's insecurities? What happens when you are, you know, are you given the room to be flawed? Are you given the room to not always be strong enough in the relationship? Because let's be honest, we all want to be in a relationship where we are allowed to be loved for who we really are. We are allowed to come flawed. We are allowed to, not always be strong all the time. And the world is already heavy. And imagine now you have to go back to the relationship and the marriage and still carry the burden of being the strong one, being the idealized one. What happens when you're effectively dehumanized by your partner by stripping away the right to be flawed? I always think that, the partner often feels like there's an invisible pressure to perform in relationships, because they have to play this role. Like with women, they have to play a role of being the wife. What does it mean to be a wife in this day and age? Does it mean to just look pretty, to cook? It's not the same as what it meant when our parents were a wife, where there was a certain role designated for them to take care of the house. Now the wives today are also businesswomen. They are also leading the family. What does it mean to play these roles, and what does that identity look like within marriage? The same as with men, what does it look like to be a husband in this day and age? Are you still being the provider? What does it mean to be in partnership with a husband if you're a woman? and how do we identify a husband in this day and age? I also realized that, all these roles lead to burnout and identity burnout because there becomes a loss of the authentic self in all relationships, be it marriage, be it boyfriend, girlfriend, because we all carry wounds, we don't allow ourselves to be vulnerable with each other. We create, like I said, we create a profile of who we are. But once you have done the sexual deeds, once you have done the chemistry, you ask yourself, am I still attracted to this person that I thought they were? It's very interesting, and it's also it creates a dynamic, of an unsustainable imbalance of power within the relationship where one is put on a pedestal and the other becomes a worshiper. And sometimes it's usually the person who wishes to be worshipped who actually puts the other person on a pedestal by infusing these weird ways of, love spells and obsession, over the other person. And if that person leaves you, and I've experienced this, it's crazy. People need to heal. Especially if the relationship didn't go out as planned and you realize in the relationship that you were an asshole to the person in that role, who play the role of the strong one. It's very interesting how the obsessor really wants the person who's about to exit the relationship to obsess over them. And, there's this constant sexual attraction and the sexualness of hunger, to bring them back and overworking, overperforming just to make sure that the relationship stays the same. It's very funny that there's a lot of masks that take place in these connections. So, if we're talking about this, how are we to, unmask these shatters? How are we to mask? How are we to shatter these masks? From the ideal to the real. From idolizing the person to realizing that the person um, is normal. And how do you still love somebody when all that 3 months of honeymoon phase has ended? When now you have to do mundane conflicts and mundane conversations and, ask them to get you a box of tissues, a box of toilet paper, all the mundane stuff, where the fantasy is now over and reality is kicking in. I think this is the reason why there's been an increase of cheating within this society because people realize after a certain time that, hang on, you're just normal, you're boring, or, uh, you know, I'm looking for some passion and I'm looking for that spark again. And instead of really learning to love the person, they're craving this sensation again to keep going, to keep being enticed, by the world. And I think it's interesting because this creates the resentment, it builds resentment. And you realize that the person in front of us isn't the savior that we imagined. They are not going to lead us into, they're not going to fulfill our insecurity. And this leads to a sense of betrayal, back to the cheating. I have no answers to this, but I do find the psychology of who we married to very interesting. Interesting because, like I said, we marry into a role, we marry into a society, we marry into the family, the person that we're dating and married to. But we also marry into a new sense of identity, that we never assigned to be in. And, one day I definitely want to marry myself. But when I speak about or when I think about all these these marriages that I've seen, I basically want to see and be honest about how do we rewrite that love again within marriage? How do we become conscious seers instead of fantasy believers? We wear, all these Disney films that we have been taught as little girls, how do we place that in reality? I love the Beauty and the Beast more because how do you love the beast of a person that you are meant to marry to or marry? And can you still love that person without the fantasy and fascination of who they are? And how do we create a sustainable intimacy, a day to day into me see you, and just love the person for the everyday mundane conflicts, and not to heighten it up for social media? How do we marry for everyday love? Because at the end of the day, I really think when you look at children who have grown up into marriage, there's a level of there's a level of solidness, you know, of sustainable love. It's not shaky. There's no woman or man who is, carrying the role and the burden of both genders. I really think it's beautiful to see how a father who is being there in the person's life, in the child's life, they've carried a sense of confidence for that child, and that child knows if I'm in love with another man and that man messes up, I don't need you, because I know myself. Instead of turning this man into becoming, oh no, I can turn, you know what I mean? Changing people into a missing piece of what we wanted from our own parents. And yeah, I think I'm going to keep this very short. But yeah, who are you married to and who do you want to marry? And also ask yourself the question, is somebody marrying you for who you really are? Because we do idolize each other a lot. And I'll see you in the next video. Ciao.